All right, for everyone who's here, we're going to get started in a moment. We're just letting everybody filter into the webinar, and then we'll get started in one minute. All right. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us here today. My name is Joshua Tucker. I'm the director of the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia at NYU. And today is the latest installment of what we call the New York City Russia Public Policy Seminar Series that we've now been running jointly between the Harriman Institute at Columbia and the Jordan Center at NYU for, I think we're into our 5th year now of doing this. We are extremely grateful to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this continuing seminar series. And I'm delighted to welcome all of you here today. Thank you so much for spending part of your time with us here today for this series. I want to just a couple of housekeeping things. Just to let you know, if you are watching us on YouTube, you can add questions in the chat at YouTube. If you're watching us on the webinar, you can use the Q&A function in the webinar format to ask questions. The format by which we're going to proceed is we're going to go through each of the speakers is going to give opening remarks of approximately about 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up to a more moderated question and answer discussion. We'll be reading the questions that come in through the Q&A button. So the nice thing about that is you're not interrupting the speakers. If you can just put the question in there wherever it comes to you. So if you're listening to one of our earlier speakers, feel free to use the Q&A chat at any time to list a question. I'm absolutely delighted. Today's topic is incredibly important, so the title of our seminar today is there civil society left in Russia? What are its prospects? And we're joined by an amazing panel of experts here to sort of talk about the state of Russian civil society, which I know is a question that has been very much on my mind since throughout the whole war period, but especially since the mobilization, the announcement of the partial general mobilization, or whatever it is that we're calling it these days. I'm absolutely delighted today to be joined as a co-host of this event by my colleague and long friend at Columbia University, Tim Fry, and I'm going to turn it over to Tim, who will take us through the speakers. So, Tim.
Great, thanks a lot. Yes, I'm really looking forward to this event as well, understanding the state of civil society in Russia, how we should study it, and whether it really matters, I think is a topic that is important from an academic perspective, but also from a policy perspective, given that many policymakers and pundits often invoke Russian society in justifying why they're choosing certain policies, like economic sanctions, for example. And we're joined with a really terrific group here today. And my job will be to introduce our terrific panel. Bios will be made available in the chat if you were looking for more detail. So I'll give very brief introductions so we can get right to it. And we'll begin with Grigory Popolekis, who is professor of politics and international affairs at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs in the Department of Politics, and the co-director of the Princeton Workshop on Post-Communist Politics. And we wanted to start off with Grigory because he's been following Russian public opinion quite closely since the start of the war in a way that I don't think anybody else has. And I think his remarks will be very helpful in setting the stage for the discussions that follow. So I'll turn the floor over to you.
You're muted, Grigo.
There we go. Did the classic boomer thing and forgot to unmute myself. Can you see my screen?
We can. We see.
Right?
Yep, we're good. Okay.
So, like I said, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. And I should say that what I'm going to present is basically setting the stage for the rest of the panel, who will have a lot more detailed things to say about civil society. This is based on these surveys, and obviously studying civil society using surveys has its limitations, but I do hope that it's going to have that there's some utility from getting this sort of broad sense of where we stand. So this is based, as Tim mentioned, on this tracking survey on Russian public opinion that I've been running together with two Princeton graduate students, Isabel De Sisto and Jacob Tucker. And we've been interviewing 200 Russian respondents per day since May 2022. So unfortunately, not since the beginning, because it took a while to get this off and get the IRB to let us do it. But we have been doing 200 people a day since then. And we have daily questions about war support, trust, and then a variety of current events that we put in as things arise. We also have a bunch of embedded survey experiments, including some of the list experiments I'm going to briefly mention today. And you can see more updated results on a daily basis at our website and on Twitter. So the broad question is how Russian public opinion has responded to the war in Ukraine, and some of what we're interested in are obviously these sort of levels and trends. But then there are also questions about how different political events affect this, and for the purposes of today, what some of the demographic patterns and potential sources of opposition might be, right? So can we tell by these surveys where we might start seeing sort of interesting developments? And so as a first step, and this is the highlight figure on our website, this is the percentage of people who say that they support the special military operation. And what you can see here, this does not include people who say don't know, no answer, but among the people who answer this direct question, what you can see is that somewhere in the low to mid 70% of Russians have been supporting the war since May. And while you can see a slight decline in the sort of latter part, which we'll get to in a second, overall, you can see that there's not a huge amount of variation in response to a whole variety of events. On the lower part, you can see the sort of noisier daily data. The graph above is smooth to deal with a sort of small sample size. But even in this noisier graph, you don't see really massive changes in, so plus or minus 3-4% in any given week at most. And so why might this be? And part of the story, obviously, is that Russian government propaganda is quite effective, at least according to our survey. Roughly 2/3 of Russian respondents believe the Ukrainian government is made up of Nazis, that the Ukrainian army is the one responsible for the deaths of Ukrainian civilians, and that, roughly speaking, the Russian government is believable in what it says about the war. So that's at some level quite worrisome. But of course, the question is how to interpret all of this. And so one question that we always get, and I thought I would address it at this point directly, is whether this might reflect fear or other types of preference, forms of preference falsification. So what we did is we ran a series of list experiments. I'd be happy to talk more about these in the Q&A if people have questions. But the idea with these list experiments is that rather than asking people directly what they think about the war, it's an indirect way that allows for plausible deniability. People just have to say how many statements they agree with on the list that in some cases includes the question about support for the war. And if you look at the graph on the left side of this, you have the direct answers to the question about the SMO, about the special military operation. On the right side of that left graph, we add up anyone who says rather support than fully support. And what you get is that up to September, about 68% of Russians express some form of support. That's if we include the don't know no answers, it goes up to about 74-75% if we exclude them. By comparison, in the list experiment, about 57% said that they supported it. So that's somewhat lower, but not drastically lower, and for the most part within the sort of confidence intervals. If we look at the effects in October, when we ran these list experiments again, what you see is that the overall direct support does not go down by a whole lot if you ask the direct question, but the list experiment support, which is the green bar on the right, goes down to 46% from about 57%. So that's a non-trivial reduction, and it's something that we need to look more into. It's a little bit unclear how much of this is fear versus possibly a softening of support and issues with the colonization. Here, without getting into too much detail, what we do is we basically break up the estimates based on the list experiment by how people answer the direct question. And one interesting thing to see, this is again broken down by May through September and then October. So the people who don't answer the direct question, for the most part, have low support for the SMO, right? So these are not people who just don't know, but in general, they seem to be opposed. So that suggests some level of preference falsification at that level. For the others, what we see is that in general, as one would expect, people with higher support on the direct question also have higher support in the indirect question. But what is interesting is that this pattern is much more pronounced when you look at the data from October in the right chart than if you look at the earlier period, which to me, to some extent, suggests that this support and opposition to the war has really crystallized a lot more over the last month and a half. And I think that might have pretty important implications. Going back to the direct questions, even beneath this sort of relative stability in overall support, what we've seen since September with a counteroffensive and then the partial mobilization is a reduction in the proportion of respondents who fully approve of the special military operation. In other words, the strong support seems to be going down, while at the same time there's been an increase in the people who completely oppose the special military operation. Right? And for the remainder of the talk, what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus primarily on these people who completely oppose the special military operation. So these are the strong opposition in some sense. And the reason I do so is because if we're going to expect active opposition to the government and possibly protests and other forms of opposition, they're most likely to come from this group. Right? Doesn't mean that others may not join, but certainly the first movers should be expected. So as a first step, we're going to look at the support between differences between men and women, and again we're going to look at the effects for the sort of early period, and then for the period post September 21st with a partial mobilization. And if you compare these two graphs, the first thing that comes out, this has been quite consistent in our data, is that men support the SMO stronger than the women. So that's just comparing the left side to the right side. The other thing that we see is that support seems to be somewhat lower, especially among younger women. Right? And this goes down farther in September, October. More importantly, again, for the purposes of purposes here is the strong opposition, and so here we're looking at again men versus women and also by age group. And what you see is that strong opposition in general is more widespread among the 18 to 24 age group, and this has grown from the early part of the war to recent weeks a fair bit. So both young men and young women are somewhere between 25 and 30% likely to express strong opposition, even in the direct question, right? Leaving out any kind of preference falsification. One of the interesting, and I should say, I don't have a graph on this here, but we've looked at education as well, and the results were not particularly strong. Turns out postgraduates are much more likely to be strongly opposed, but there's not a whole lot of them, and there's not massive differences between the other groups. The other thing that we did is we used, since we have a very large sample, for any city that had at least 300 respondents, we looked at the prevalence of this sort of strong opposition. And here are some of the differences across different cities. Somewhat to our surprise, but perhaps not to people who sort of know these cities better. Moscow in particular and St. Petersburg to some extent have not been at the complete top of the list. And interestingly, also the top of the list seems to be a bunch of cities, including Smolensk and Rostov, who are quite close to the Ukrainian border. So there is something about this regionally that we think is quite interesting. In this next graph, what we do is we compare these trends at the city level, and here's a smaller set of cities because since we split the sample by time, we set a somewhat higher threshold for including them because we don't want to be drawing conclusions from 70, 80 respondents in any sort of given group. And so here in blue, what you have is the strong anti-war, sort of strong opposition to the war in May through September. And then in orange, it's after the partial mobilization started. And what you see is that in many of the cities, this support has increased. The strong opposition has increased, including in places like Moscow. St. Petersburg, on the other hand, seems to have come down a little bit, as well as Smolensk and Krasnoyarsk. But again, if we're looking at the top 10 cities, this support has increased, and in some cases, fairly noticeable, right? So what this means is that in a bunch of these large cities, we have somewhere around the fifth to maybe up to a quarter of residents. And I should say that all of the results I've shown you include weights that try to balance based on demographic characteristics. But we have about 25% of people who will openly say that they strongly oppose the war. And so arguably it is from these that at least the early protests are likely to be drawn. And so the question is, how will that happen, and what role can civil society play to mobilize some of these opponents? Then looking at some of the occupational characteristics, the first thing, so this is the predicted probability of being strongly opposed to the SMO, and this is in the sort of this is overall. And what you see is that there are not massive differences. Perhaps not surprisingly, the military is lower than most others. And then the two categories that are higher are those self-employed, who may be less likely to get fired. We'll get to that in a second, and students, for whom it's much higher. If we look at the same data for the sort of post-mobilization period, we see a even bigger difference between students and everybody else. So for students, about a third of them are strongly anti-war in this period, irrespective of where they are. Okay. And then finally, to this question, okay, so so we have these levels of opposition, and they're concentrated among in certain areas and among certain demographic groups. But the question, obviously, as both the early anti-war protests and many earlier political protests in Russia have illustrated, the problem is how you deal with repression by the government. And so one question that we ask people is how likely there would be that speaking out about the SMO would entail different types of costs. And what we show here is 3 different types of costs. One of them is social costs, such as losing friends, then problems at work and getting arrested. And each of the categories are either very likely, somewhat unlikely, and very unlikely. And we break this down by people who are opponents versus supporters of the war. And not surprisingly, opponents tend to think that these costs are more likely, particularly getting arrested. Roughly half of oppositionists think that speaking out against the war can get you arrested. That's compared to less than 1/5 for those who support the war. But again, these are not the only types of problems that people worry about. And then there's a sort of subsequent question: if people were to protest and the government represses, how would the population react? Right? There's this trade-off between pacifying people versus getting them angrier because the government is using force. And here on the right bars in this graph, which are whether the government is justified in repressing unsanctioned protests. What you see is that about 25% say that they're never justified, and another 50% say that sometimes. Right now, sometimes is somewhat of a big category. But what we see here is that there's basically a fair bit of uncertainty over sort of how the population will react to this. And certainly there's a 25% group that would react quite badly to this. Right? And then finally, just as next steps, we're in the process of trying to field a number of questions about particular types of dissent, right? So it matters whether you talk to your friends or whether you talk at work or whether you're going out and posting things on social media or going to public demonstrations. We're also we're going to ask some questions that are more direct about different types of participation in different both pro and anti-war activities. We want to see whether personal contact with either participants in the war or victims from the war makes a difference. I will stop here to sort of let others talk, but I'm really looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grigor, for that really wonderful and rich data that I think we'll all be chewing on for quite some time. So really thanks for doing that project. Next, we hear from Janet Johnson, who's a professor at Brooklyn College with long interests in social movements, gender politics, and human rights. So Janet, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you. I guess it makes sense to start with the women, since we now know that the women are the most likely to oppose the war, or least likely to support the war. So I've been following women's and feminist organizing in Russia for nearly 3 decades, especially against domestic violence and gender-based violence. And I situate my work within gender politics across post-communist and European context. My reflections here are greatly informed by the work of and collaborations with Valerie Sperling, Lisa McIntosh-Sundstrom, and Alexandra Novitskaya. And my plan is to briefly discuss the kind of organizing before the 2022 war to provide some background, and then reflect a bit on what kind of women and feminist organizing has been happening since February. So just a brief note on method. The war means that we need different approaches, especially those of us who do immersive research. Our research has to become more unobtrusive. It has to be guided by ethical concerns of doing no harm. And we have to make do with even more partial information. I also think we can only talk about Russia in a way that takes seriously what Russia is doing in Ukraine, as many of us did not account for Russia's imperial ambitions. So just the background before the full-scale war started in February. Over the last decade, women's and feminist organizing had changed dramatically from the 1990s. Such organizing was no longer structured around NGOs struggling for foreign funding, often disconnected from a domestic constituency. They transformed themselves in response to the dramatic decline in international funding and the increasing repression, such as the Foreign Agent, Undesirable Organization, and anti-gay propaganda laws. In specific, such organizing coalesced around a smaller set of issues, especially domestic violence. Such organizing adopted new techniques, especially involved social media, such as online flash mobs against sexual harassment started by Ukrainian activists in 2016, while also re-embracing conventional social movement tactics. The largest post-Soviet feminist street protests were in St. Petersburg in 2019 against and around the Khachaturian sisters case, where they were charged with murdering their father, who had been abusing them for a long time. And we have a feminist activist who I'll talk about, who ran for a seat in the Duma in 2021. Such feminist and women's organizing also developed into a 3-pronged movement. On the one hand, you had feminist NGOs and women's crisis centers that continue to take a feminist stand against such issues as domestic violence, who were struggling to survive, and several had been placed on the foreign agent list. Then you had the guerrilla feminisms of Pussy Riot and other groups that embrace provocative and radical actions, including TERF feminisms, anti-trans feminisms, anarchist and anti-colonial feminisms. And then third, you had under the radar organizations that appealed to state interest and were working with the state as best they could, and they would use language such as, quote, happy families instead of domestic violence. All of this activism before the war resulted in some increasing support for feminist ideas over the last few years. 2021 survey found that 94% of respondents agreed that childcare responsibility should be shared equally between parents. 97% responded that a husband hitting his wife or girlfriend was unjustifiable. And there were some small reforms over the last couple of years, most notably a shortened list of professions that were banned for women in 2019. But the broader context before the war has been backlash, right? Most remarkably, the domestic violence partial decriminalization in 2017, and then the constitutional amendments in 2020 that cemented heterosexual marriage. So moving on to what we can see since the launching of the full-scale war, the second part of the invasion in February. And I'm going to use a couple of vignettes to kind of illustrate what I think we know about what's going on. Most remarkably, I think most of you are familiar with the feminist anti-war resistance, and I'm going to quote them. It is a horizontal movement launched by activists. They call on feminists around the world to unite against the war and regularly engage in various methods of protest, writing anti-war slogans on banknotes, installing art objects and memorials in city spaces, posting information about war crimes in Ukraine and anti-war campaigns, wearing all black in public as a sign of mourning, handing out flowers, and making viral anti-war postcards for broadcast lists on WhatsApp. In addition, they've been providing practical psychological support, helping Ukrainians who are displaced or forcibly deported, helping, and since the mobilization, helping men and women who have been mobilized for the war. So this is an international group or a transnational group with diaspora feminists being the most visible actors, such as Ella Rossman in London, who was a founder of one of this thing called Anti-University, which is part of this new wave of feminist activism before the war. But inside Russia, there are several dozen feminist organizations that seem to be involved, as well as individual feminists across the breadth of Russia. They are, quote, loose and anonymous affinity groups where each person does their own task, but does not show their face. They're anonymous even to each other in Russia for security reasons. And the consequences for activists who have been involved with this group are quite severe in Russia. Most famously is the St. Petersburg artist Sasha Sokolenko, who was arrested in April for replacing 5 supermarket price tags with stickers containing information about civilian deaths in Mariupol. She's being tried under Russia's law against, quote, disinformation and facing up to 10 years in prison. She's had a tooth removed without proper treatment. She is not receiving a gluten-free diet that she needs for her autoimmune disease, and she's still being held. And it's currently a middle of a ridiculous linguistic analysis to show that the information that she posted, which apparently was true, is not true, according to the Russian authorities. A second example is Lolya Nordic, an eco-feminist who's affiliated with the group who fled to Tallinn in March. She had already been a target of SFB, the FSB, but things escalated and she had to flee within 24 hours. She currently suffers from PTSD and is still receiving threats from Kremlin-supported thugs and doing her best to protest outside the Russian embassy, for example, in Tallinn. A third example is St. Petersburg artist and activist Palladia, that's the name she's going by, who was arrested on May 9th, the day that the first issue of Zhenskaya Pravda, a print newspaper disseminating truthful news, we have to say truthful news about the war, the day that it was published, she'd been hiding out, she turned her phone back on, they found her immediately. They searched her place on March 8th already and had confiscated her computer and phone. She was wearing a backpack on the streets that said Net Vanya, and as far as I understand, she's still in Russia. So what we have with the anti-feminist resistance here, anti-war feminist resistance, is the kind of transnational activism that combines exiles and residents that has been explored by Laura Henry and Elizabeth Planton in the environmental movement in an article forthcoming in Post-Soviet Affairs. So that's one vignette, the feminist anti-war resistance. 2 more vignettes. I want to compare 2 domestic violence activists, Alyona Popova and Marie Davtyan. Popova is an activist and entrepreneur who has been the face of the anti-domestic violence movement in Russia for the last several years. She arrived at the Wilson Center in October of 2021 after her unsuccessful Duma run with the Yabloko party. Her plan was to be there until the end of this month. She actively posts on Facebook, Twitter, and Telegram. She has 54,000 followers on Facebook, 23 on Telegram, and 119 on Twitter, 119,000 on Twitter. She posts a lot about what's happened in the war. She continues to post about sexual harassment and domestic violence. And in October of this year, she was put on the foreign agent list for her work against Ukraine, against the war in Ukraine. In contrast, Davtyan is a lawyer who helped draft legislation against domestic violence several times for the Duma over the last couple of years. She works for an NGO, the Consortium of Women Non-Governmental Organizations. She's a women's rights activist. She has a much smaller media audience, and she continues to be active. She has recently was part of a project that submitted an alternative or a shadow report for the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, on the rights of girls facing sexual abuse. She has made comments on her Facebook page, such as posting the meme about zinc coffins in garbage as an illustration of the cost to Russian soldiers. And she's presented at national conferences. And as far as I can tell, she has not had any consequences and is still living in Moscow. So those give you sort of the contrast to what individual activists are able and not able to do. And then the last vignette I want to give you to close is a transnational faith-based women's organization that I'm going to leave nameless, that is headquartered in the United States, but has been organizing in several post-Soviet societies, including Russia and Ukraine. They do feminist work around domestic violence and women's health. And just some notes from my conversation with the director. So she says that most transnational projects and organizations in Russia have collapsed. Quote, no one will fund Russia. It is back to the old days of sending money person to person, right? So they're meeting outside of the country with $10,000. We remember this from the earlier period of our lives, those of us who are around, but maybe not 10,000, but $10,000 because they can only bring $10,000 back to Russia. There's additional regulatory hurdles in the United States. Organizations that need to work in Russia need to get officially sanctioned relationships with Russia, much like Iranian activists have had to do, that will allow funds to be transferred using the conventional banking system. To do so, though, they have to use coded language for the United States that they're doing, quote, humanitarian work and, quote, building civil society. In Russia, they're still able to do some feminist work by reframing for the Russian context. So they no longer do, quote, leadership training for women. They do, quote, faith-based heritage activities. They no longer work on domestic violence explicitly, but on, quote, peace in the home and, quote, living with dignity and, quote, while quote, playing for peace in the world. So they use this very coded language in the Russian context. But Russian activists working for these organizations are not radically against the war. Those in Russia, especially since the mobilization, the partial mobilization, the conscription, the forced conscription, don't want their sons and husbands to serve in the military. They feel traumatized by the things that they're facing. For example, not just the missing younger men, but that older men are being laid off and also the collapsing economy in society. But they don't seem to have perspective that the Ukrainians are facing a whole different level of crisis in that case. So that kind of activism exists in Russia. It has been challenging both the war, the feminist anti-war resistance kind of connects those issues most explicitly. That Russia has been building an authoritarian regime based on violence, that it's now not just letting loose on its own people in the form of decriminalizing domestic violence, but against the Ukrainians. So what we have is also in the Russian context, that there has been an increased backlash against women's issues and feminist issues. There are several anti-gender policy efforts in the Duma right now, a bill banning the use of public health insurance for abortions, a bill banning, quote, information about the child-free lifestyle, a term that simply refers to women making a choice not to have children, and a bill expanding the gay propaganda law to all situations, not just among minors. And Putin's language over the last year has become increasingly conservative around gender identity issues. For example, in his September 30th annexation speech, he said, do we want to have here in our country, in Russia, parent number 1, parent number 2, and parent number 3? They have completely lost it, meaning the West, instead of mother and father. So that's my overview of what we know, or what I know about, and I look forward to hearing questions, comments, and additional information from all of you.
Fantastic. And trying to grapple with this nebulous concept of civil society, it's really helpful to approach it from multiple directions. So we have one micro level focus on vignettes on particular activists and particular issues, combined with this real aggregate macro view from from Grigory. So this has been a really helpful start. Now we'll turn to Tatiana Margolin, who is a JD and an LLM, and also the founding partner of Stroika, with long experience promoting civil society and fighting authoritarianism in the region, previously at the Open Society Foundation. So Tatiana, can I turn the floor over to you?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me on this panel. And it was fascinating. And I'm glad I'm going after Janet, because I think some of the things I'm going to say are going to mirror and kind of echo what you have said in your presentation. So, and again, I don't think any conversations we're having right now are a substitute to actually speaking to members of Russian civil society. But I think it is also good to take kind of a broader academic look at what's going on, which is what I see this event as being. So I think both are true about this moment in Russia. And I think everyone here is not unused to contradictions about Russia, but both there's no civil society left in Russia. I think we can definitely argue that that's the case. And at the same time, there are a number of really important civil society groups and initiatives pursuing critical work in Russia. And I hope that a little bit in my presentation, I'm gonna unpack how both can really be true. So for example, we all know that the war against civil society in Russia didn't just begin on February 24th. It's been a steady march towards decimation of civil society. And I think actually, at least for me, someone who's been working in the region and considering myself as someone building civil society there, helping build civil society there, the war provided a lot of answers to questions that seemed misunderstood, at least by myself and my colleagues. For example, when Memorial was being shut down, I think a lot of us really had questions as to why go against this institution that so many people, so many ordinary Russians really benefited from. You can probably hardly find a single one who has not benefited from Memorial. They seemed so kind of vegetarian to me, at least at the time. But of course, now that we know that the goal and the end result has been war, then you realize that certainly in the authoritarian toolbox, rewriting memory and shutting down access to memory is a critical piece of it. So the war, in a lot of ways, for us, those who've been working and watching civil society there, it's really provided an answer as to why all of these moves. I think you can still say that even though nothing is left there, a lot is still happening there. And I'm still kind of unsure how that can be. But again, many of us are not unused to dichotomies and contradictions within Russia. So for example, at this moment, most leaders of civil society are in exile. We can definitely say that there's no opposition left in Russia, and the ones who are left in Russia, they are in prison. There's no free media left based in Russia. I think maybe there are some minor exceptions to the rule, and I think definitions at this time of what is free media are also shifting in Russia. But nevertheless, I think it's true to say that there's no free media based there. Thousands upon thousands of people have fled. Many are lingering in prison, have been in prison since February 24th, and others are facing prospects of it. And every day we read about new trials. As you know, every Friday, new people are being added to the foreign agent lists. There are no public spaces left. And that, I think, is the most damaging and dangerous part of this moment, because we always believed, while supporting civil society in Russia, that creation of public spaces is critically important. People need an opportunity to come together. And now there are no, that's not there anymore. It's unsafe, and everything has been driven back into this proverbial dissident kitchen. And also, I think what's most upsetting and disturbing is that there's really no talk of any vision for the future, because the country is really solidly and firmly looking backwards and is fighting a 20th century war, refighting and rewriting history that, of 100 years ago at this point, or close to 100 years ago. So I think these are all very disturbing and upsetting signs of the current moment. But at the same time, these are not the Soviet dissident days. We can all agree that there is internet, there are VPNs, there's YouTube that's still not been banned in Russia. I have not seen the ban of Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram impact that much access to these platforms. We have Sergei Mironov, a deputy, posting on Twitter regularly. So it's sort of this pretense, the veil that's been removed. No one pays attention to these bans anymore. And information really is accessible, which I think is, for those of us watching, that's what makes this moment particularly sad. You can no longer say that, people don't know any better, because people really have opportunities to access information. This is not the 70s. This is not the moment of sort of radios in the kitchen. And the borders are also not entirely closed. And so again, this moment, we all, Janet, I think you said, it's like bringing, money in suitcases. There are moments that harken us back to the past, but there are also moments that make this very different than the past. And I think also for many of us kind of remove excuses for Russian civil society, for Russians in general, for kind of not accessing the truth or seeing the truth. But I'm going to talk about 3 examples of really important activism that I see taking place still on the ground, and also from exile, which is also what I think is so interesting, and I hope many PhDs will be written about it someday. But I would say I would start with prisoners' rights. And prison work is something that I did actually when I first started working in Russia, and it was always one of the more promising aspects of building civil society there, because as you know, Russian society has a very different view of prisons and prisoners. Many families, if not most, know someone who has been in prison, or in general, it's very common to know someone who is serving time or has served time. And, it's a society that's very familiar with prisons. And I would say that Russijashe and their other organizations working on prisoners' rights have been really pivotal and critical at this moment. And many of the leaders of this movement are not on the ground anymore. They're in exile, but are still exposing and breaking huge stories globally. So for example, of course, without prison rights activists, we wouldn't know about egregious violations of prisoners' rights. And we wouldn't know the story necessarily of Yevgeny Prigozhin drafting people from prisons into the Wagner group and sending inmates onto the front line. So I think the access to lawyers for the families of prisoners that have been provided to folks who want to fight their loved ones being sent to this war. It's been really incredible to watch. And, Russian prisons notoriously have both been some of the most closed settings, but also ones from which we somehow still get a lot of information. Because again, it's another one of these Russian contradictions that both can't be true. On the one hand, no one can visit. And on the other hand, we are seeing these images, we're seeing recordings of Prigozhin walking around and recruiting people. And so I think that kind of activism has been really pivotal at this moment. And I don't see it really decreasing. I really see it just blooming and blossoming and really getting more spotlight, which again, it's most unfortunate that this is the case at this moment, but I think it's one of the most needed. And then I will move on to sort of the mainstream human rights defenders. And I will say again, from someone who used to sit in philanthropy, a lot of philanthropy has sort of turned away from the traditional human rights defenders, where we're looking for something more innovative, something more special. We were a little bit tired of funding the same old groups, but we've really seen this moment that these groups are the most needed on the ground. So for example, when the war broke out, we didn't just see demand for these groups like Obodenko and Agora and others. We didn't just see demand in their work and their services from people who were trying to run away and escape the war, but we actually saw the same cops and siloviki turning to their services, turning to them for help, the same ones who were facing them, in courtrooms on the other side, because the first wave of people being sent to the war was, of course, people who were in the army and people who were close to the military industrial complex. So, and this is really, I think, a sign of actually a really healthy civil society where human rights groups are representing not just sort of the traditional, human rights customers that they've always had, but they're representing people they disagree with. They're representing people they oftentimes despise, and provide the same fair representation to them, and do it in earnest, forgetting any kind of qualms they've had about these folks in the past. So I think it's really been incredible to watch. And again, I think in the case of human rights defenders, this is really one where we see people, this is not one you can do from exile. We see some groups, we see Ivan Pavlov in Georgia trying to overseeing attorneys on the ground. And that, I think, kind of managing that process you could do from abroad, but you really need physical lawyers to be going with people to court and representing them. So I think that's been, and again, the people who've stayed and who are doing that work are facing incredible challenges. They're facing, a lot of danger, and they're still doing it. So I think that's actually a sign of really vibrant moments for civil society, in an environment in which there is no civil society. I think, again, Jana touched a little bit on relocations and people escaping, and that's been a whole other stream of activism, where we see people who would never consider themselves activists in the past, activating and setting up these really ingenious schemes, almost an underground railroad of sorts of getting people out. And we see immense creativity there. We see people taking really incredible security precautions, really lessons for civil society the world over as to how to do something like this in this very dangerous and precarious moment. And finally, I will end with something that I would honestly say, obsessed with over years, is Russian independent media. Right? This is something that has been, I think, a jewel in the country, where we have had access, not just since the beginning of the war, but I would say over the last at least 5 years, we've had access to incredible investigations, incredible stories, incredible quality of journalism, not just quantity, but really quality journalism, where we see, the New York Times winning Pulitzer Prizes based on initial breaking investigations by journalists of Project, the tiny media that was started 3 years ago. So I think independent media of Russia has really been playing an unbelievably important role. And what's also incredible to see is that we are seeing new outlets pop up. We're seeing a lot of things that we were trying to build almost artificially when I was a donor happen really organically right now. So for example, we were always trying to encourage regional media to grow and trying to identify regional media. And it was always really a struggle, because the best journalists were oftentimes just going to the capitals. Even the St. Petersburg journalists from like Apantanka would be moving to Moscow for better opportunities. And what we're seeing right now is, again, it's all done under new rules. We see a lot of anonymous reporting. So I think a lot of kind of traditional journalistic standards and kind of things we're used to, they can't be applicable in this moment of the law against fakes, et cetera. But we're seeing really a renaissance of Russian independent media, both in exile and on the ground. And I will say that, unfortunately, again, like everything in Russia, it's a total conundrum and a dichotomy, where I think the media was really well served by the fact that it was prosecuted and persecuted and pushed out before the war. So they had time to, most of them, I would say, left in the summer of 2021, in the fall of 2021. So they had time to set up operations. And really, when war broke out, they were ready to go. They were ready to report their newsrooms. Many of them were already abroad. Not all, but many were already set to go. So I want to end here, and because I want to give us a lot of opportunity to answer any questions at the end. Thank you very much. Handing it over to the next speaker.
Fantastic. It was really helpful. And I think the emphasis on independent media is particularly important right now. Now we'll hear from Natalia Forat, who's at the University of Michigan with a PhD from Northwestern, and has written on state-society relations in a variety of forms within Russia. Natalia?
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be on this panel. So I am going to suggest some of the general, ideas about Russian civil society before February 2022 and its reaction to the war that will echo some of the things that previous speakers have said already. So I want to suggest that we kind of step back a little bit before we talk about civil society right now and look at what happened to Russian civil society in the decade before the war, before the invasion in February 2022. So if we look at how it developed since, let's say, the electoral protests in 2011, 2012, we will see that Russian civil society has definitely become a lot more sophisticated, a lot better organized, and increasingly able to survive in a more and more repressive environment. So since those protests, of course, the thing that people noticed on the Russian kind of liberal front from outside of Russia, one thing that people definitely know is the rise of Alexei Navalny as the leader of Russian liberal opposition. But besides him and his team, there are a lot of projects, grassroots projects. Some of them are political ones, meaning that, or like the ones who are geared towards defending political freedoms and rights, and others are not political. They are social. They are targeting different causes in society. But they all shared some key characteristics. They all increasingly relied on horizontal networks. They all used a lot of volunteers, and they all used a lot of crowdfunding, which was definitely facilitated by the technological development that took place during that decade. And as some have already mentioned, of course, Putin's regime wasn't just sitting still and watching this development of civil society. It has been developing its repressive apparatus and increasing the pressure on civil society. Most of the time, this pressure has been increasing gradually, so that civil society actors were able to adjust, to regroup, to find new ways to work in these new conditions. But that lasted up until 2021, when we had like another huge repression wave. And now we understand that probably that was at the time when decision about the war has been made. And that was kind of a preemptive way to make sure that by the time it starts, some of the most experienced and known activists, including those at the regional and local levels, they are either in jail or under house arrest or in exile, something like that. So as a result, this anti-war resistance that we've observed since February, it has been, according to Over the Info, actually, it has been one of the most grassroots, like uncoordinated and decentralized protests in Russia, probably the most uncoordinated and decentralized protests in Russia in the last decade. So we, of course, saw quite a bit of street protests in the first days and weeks, but then after another wave of repressive legislation, those street protests faded away, and the resistance turned to more to different forms that are less visible, and they are usually driven by the actors that we have not really seen before, that were not as known before. And those actors, such as the feminist anti-war resistance, such as some other networks, they're usually depersonalized horizontal networks, coordinated often through Telegram. Someone made an estimate in June of this year. On Telegram, there were 55 channels that were coordinating a network of 250,000 subscribers. And the activities that those networks engaged in, I think they fell generally into two buckets. One bucket was just basically reducing the harm done by war. And that was help to Ukrainians who found themselves in Russia for different reasons to escape, to just like have just some basic conditions to connect with each other, to leave for Europe. Since the mobilizations was announced in Russia, the same networks have been helping Russian men to leave the country when they didn't want to fight. Some of those groups, like some anarchist groups, they turned to more radical methods, something like railroad sabotage. So we know that the number of railroad accidents has increased in Russia, and they're claiming credit for that, that they are trying to slow down supplies to the front lines. So that's one bucket. And another bucket is basically maintaining the anti-war agenda in the public space while trying to keep the activists relatively safe. And Janet, I think, mentioned some of the ways that the feminist anti-war resistance has been doing it. There are several projects that are run by Russians from abroad that are aiming to spread anti-war messages in Одноклассники and Vkontakte. So those have been also run by volunteers, including the diaspora members who just left Russia or those who have been outside of Russia for some time. So the big question, of course, is, well, does it even matter? We understand that the scale of suffering in Ukraine is just completely incomparable to all these like small efforts. And the question is, could Russian civil society do better, essentially? Is it possible, was it possible to stage some, large protests in the very beginning of the war, so that they would change Putin's decision-making, things like that. And, I would argue that unfortunately, the Russian civil society was just not in the position to do so. So there are, of course, many reasons why this is, why I'm arguing this way. And that includes, of course, repression that we mentioned. But also, I think one of the main reasons is that the war itself and the narratives around the war that have been spread by the Russian media resonated with the widespread anti-Western sentiment in Russian society and the value of collective security. So if we look at the public opinion polls in the months leading up to the February invasion, we do not see any change in attitudes to Ukrainians, but we do see an increased fear of the world war and of a nuclear war. So some research that has been done by Andrei Semyonov recently and his team on what kind of messages resonated on social networks, what kind of messages out of a whole array of them that have been thrown into the public space by the Russian state-controlled media have been picked up by social media users. And what they found was that it wasn't really the narratives about Ukrainians being Nazis. Those were the narratives about the NATO threat and the threat of the West to Russia. So basically, in this narrative, of course, Ukraine doesn't have any agency, and the Ukrainian government is just a mere puppet of the US. And of course, the goal of the US is to harm Russia, to destroy Russia. So this wide anti-Western sentiment in Russian society made it extremely difficult to counteract those narratives. The development that Russian civil society has gone through in the previous decade kind of made a lot of issues on the domestic sphere, such as environment, such as social policies, like all these kinds of things, a matter of debate between civil society and the state. That's where they had some say, and they had some support of the population. They could make some argument, they could actually do something. The realm of foreign policy, the realm of national security is unfortunately the realm where civil society is simply absent. And it does not have any authority in the eyes of an average Russian to provide some kind of, alternative information or alternative narrative. So what are some of the maybe conclusions that probably follow from these ideas? So I think that unfortunately, we probably should not expect a wide anti-war resistance in Russia, even when the number of casualties rise, even when people start having more information about those casualties. I can see how we will observe separate, protests here and there, like relatives of these mobilized men would gather and start writing letters or go protest somewhere. But there is just no capacity right now. There is no one to organize any kind of wide resistance. So in the long term, I also think that given the anti-Western sentiment, how this war will probably solidify in Russian minds, I feel like the Russian liberal opposition may want to rethink the discursive connection of its agenda to the West. It's not that all Russian opposition leaders are trying to connect the vision of future Russia to the West, but quite a few of them do. And it seems that to resonate with Russian society, that agenda should be framed as authentic. And this is a very, very non-trivial task, how to do that. And then, of course, given how much kind of loyalty the Russians have shown to the state, how much their public opinion swung from like 8% support to armed invasion in December to almost 80 in March, that calls probably for very, very extreme caution in developing future relations with Russia for the Western countries, for Europe and for the US, because even if in some long term we see weakening of the state in Russia and maybe another more open political period, I feel like what we are observing now is the evidence of how the state can have another rebound. The statist loyalty can have another rebound if there is, you know, a condition where Russians are shown, you know, some kind of threat from outside, and that national security and collective security values kick in again. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I really appreciate that link to a policy discussion. And certainly the relationship of Russia and the West is being renegotiated even as we speak. And we shouldn't forget that you know, the West has agency in how it's perceived as well. And a dysfunctional West is a much less attractive model for many Russians. And perhaps the best thing the West, however we want to refer to it, could do would be to get its house in order and make it a more attractive system of government. So thanks a lot to that. Finally, we'll hear from Jeremy Morris, who is the author of Everyday Post-Socialism. He's an expert on political economy, labor, and ethnographic approaches to understanding Russia. And once he's finished, then we'll open up the floor for discussion. So, but first, let's hear from Jeremy. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. I hope you can all hear me. So I'd like to kind of make a little bit of a departure from the kind of approaches that we've heard so far, although a lot of what I have to say, you know, chimes, I think, with all of our speakers. So as you just heard, my methodological approach to studying Russia is ethnographic immersion, something that Janet mentioned earlier, an immersive approach. So before the war, I developed a group of research informants over decades, in fact, and in the run-up to the war and as the war began, and since the summer, I have been in daily contact with quite a significant variety of different kinds of Russian people, and I have been to Russia for a significant period since the war began. So this is what I bring, and hopefully it will allow our audience to put into perspective some of the different approaches that we've heard so far. So if we talk about public opinion, and obviously I'm coming to this from a very different perspective, having spoken to all kinds of people, from blue-collar workers to activists to pensioners to people working in the security services in Russia. And what I would like to emphasize is that there isn't really, I would say there isn't really a pro or anti-war constituency. There are people that express loyalty, passive consent, and some of them will surely have shown up in Grigoriy's work, in the ongoing responses that he gets to Russia Watcher. But certainly, having been able to triangulate my own findings by spending a significant amount of time in Russia since the war began, you know, I could characterize responses from the vast majority of people using a set of keywords such as depression, despair, resignation, anomie, and sometimes disavowal and denial, certainly. It's kind of ironic, I guess, that out of the dozens of people that I have built research relationships with over the last decades, only one person could I find who expressed enthusiasm and approval for the military campaign. Only one person, and it wasn't somebody connected to the regime in any way. It wasn't somebody whose job depended upon loyalty to the regime. I mean, obviously, for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to be a bit vague. There's some things that I can't say publicly. What I will say also is that I'm very fortunate to be able to engage with activists who remain in country. So we heard a lot about exile. We heard a lot about and we heard from the last two speakers, in fact, that indeed leaders of civil society leaving Russia was in itself a form of activism, which I completely agree with. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the vast majority of people opposed to the war and opposed to Putin have stayed in Russia. Why? Because they don't have the resources to leave. And so these are some of the people that I study. And I'll come to them in a moment. Before that, in preparing for this round table, I was asked just to say a little bit about mobilization, right? Because perhaps the majority of my informants are military age, working class men. In fact, that's really whom I wrote my book about. And I have to say that there is very little active opposition or active resistance among these people. But for quite obvious reasons. Again, they really lack the resources to do anything about the predicament that they find themselves in. So not a single military age conscriptable man expressed enthusiasm, not a single man that I spoke to would want to go and fight, would volunteer. Nobody would. In the main, the response is that this is a crazy thing to do, right? Indeed, somebody who in fact works for the police and could be considered adjacent to those that might express loyalty or even enthusiasm spoke about how he and his group of men in their 20s who work for the police and the security services, in fact, looked down on those that had volunteered as clearly motivated by monetary gain. And so it wasn't considered a patriotic thing to do to volunteer. What about other forms of resistance? Now, I was hoping before I had gone to Russia that the conscriptable age men that I know would perhaps at least, passively resist, try and hide. And what it comes increasingly clear to me is that resignation, unfortunately, here is the governing emotion. Once again, because of the lack of resources in avoiding conscription, right? Having said that, there are still avenues open to less, let's say, socioeconomically resourceful men. And one of which is to try and get a job in an industry or an enterprise that will, in some formal or informal way, be able to protect them from the draft. But once again, something that did actually surprise me was the zero enthusiasm among working class younger men and indeed older men for the special military operation. Indeed, if I can just present you with one really quick vignette, I was even able to observe firsthand one man taking a neighbor to task for having a Z stencil on his car, right? The person with the Z stencil was not my informant, but was the neighbor of one of my informants. And ridiculing his reasons for having this Z. The neighbor could not articulate why he had put this stencil on his car and became the butt of ridicule from his neighbor. So let me then move on to back to activism then. What activism remains? So before the war started, I was quite involved with labor rights activists, most of whom have remained. And so we should, and I'm sure, I'm sure our other speakers are aware of this. Of course, there is significant anti-war activism, both at home and abroad. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the horizontalism that the previous speakers have spoken about, what that actually meant in practice is people migrate from cause to cause, right? And I think what we're going to see is an increasing impossibility of opposing the war openly. I mean, we've already seen that because people that oppose it are in prison or abroad. That does not mean that civil society, in inverted commas, ends. Already what I'm seeing is people migrating to politically less dangerous causes, such as ecology, something that was already a very important cause. You know, the anti-trash protests are likely to come back in different ways. The people that were trained through being involved in anti-trash ecological protests, they're going to they've honed their skills, and they're not going anywhere. That, you know, there is still, what I want to kind of end on is that there is still it seems like there is little capacity for open protest, but that does not mean there is no capacity for the development of civil society in other directions, including, it has to be said, in ways that are safe politically to the regime. And, you know, people that are incredibly opposed to Putin and Putinism, they're not stupid. You know, they will perhaps of necessity engage with the regime where it suits their immediate aims. And so just then to perhaps end on the war again, people that I'm in close contact with, they still are doing what they can despite all of these difficulties. So we are seeing consistent, small, almost mundane and still dangerous actions such as anti-war graffiti, graffiti in support of Ukraine, and so on, and defacing pro-war public posters, right, which we see in quite a lot of cities, right? So civil society is not going away; it's going to be morphing, it's transforming. Activists migrate. They have always been, you know, grassroots activists have always been nomadic, right? They've always been going from one cause to another as those causes became more or less politically, you know, possible to open up in terms of contention. So it's not a wholly negative picture, but I thought I would just, in the 10 minutes that were allowed to me, bring you some kind of grounded, immersive information, observations from my own very long-standing interaction with a hugely diverse set of informants, both before and since the war began. Thank you very much again.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. It's interesting to think of your remarks in a comparison with how the public responded to the annexation of Crimea in 2014, where I'm sure you have gotten a very different response, even though if we look at some of the public opinion polls in aggregate, you know, we would see similar huge spikes. So, and again, it's really important to study civil society from a variety of angles, so it's important to have these really diverse perspectives. But let me now turn it over to Josh to kick off the question and answer session. And I want to thank everybody.
Yeah, thank you all for super interesting remarks sparking this discussion here. We can still take questions, but we have about 15 minutes or so left to answer Q&A here. So what I thought I would do is put forward a couple of different questions for panel and give each of the panelists a chance to decide what they want to respond to in these questions. And so just because we only have about 15 minutes left, and that would give everyone, hopefully we can give everyone a chance and touch on a few different topics. So one question that's come up that came on from Talia Kolik in the Q&A was this question that seems to come across a number of the different presentations, which is the difference between the center and the regions. And so I was wondering if some might want to comment a little bit more about, you know, fundamental differences that are being seen here between the level of civil society outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg, and even outside of bigger cities. And do you foresee civil society as it moves forward in Russia being more kind of centered in Moscow, St. Petersburg than it was previously, or is it less centered, as Jeremy was saying, as it's morphing in these kinds of things? So that's one question to throw out there. A second question to throw out there is, I was kind of taken, I was kind of taken a bit by the question that came up in Tatiana in your talk, and I think you kind of got this a bit in your answer to Matt Rojansky's question in the Q&A. But I think there's another question that sort of runs through a lot of the talks about what is the current situation that we find ourselves in terms of external support for Russian civil society, which has been an on again, off again topic, you know, for the last 30 years here. But we're now in this situation of kind of enhanced sanctions, right? And I've heard, in one of the people talking about, like support for, I think Tatjana, it was you said, support for, Russian civil society is drying up. We had the discussion about having to bring money, having to bring cash back in. Is this something, I guess, the external support for Russian civil society? It would be super interesting to hear a kind of take on the extent to which this is something that is going to be sort of, is there a salvageable part here, right? Is it, I remember about some of Val Sperling's earlier work that, civil society can get too dependent on external funding and turn into grant writing organizations, right? Is there some of this morphing going on that Jeremy says that might in some sense be positive for Russian civil society? If not, if the external support is something that's needed to continue to support Russian civil society, what's blocking it now? Like if it's dropped off tremendously, is it legal blocks in the sense that like, is this something that needs to be rethought in the sanctions regime? Or is it more of social blocks, right? That institutions don't want to be seen supporting or providing money into Russia? Or is it just, blocks from inside of Russia and that it's just become too dangerous for people to accept? So I'll throw those two questions out there, and anyone who would like to jump in about one of those two questions would be great. So Tatjana, you have your hand up. Do you want to start?
Sure. Yes. I guess I will start with your last question, and it's a very difficult one, Josh, and it's a very uncomfortable moment because I think in the global conversation of progressive folks who are paying attention to this war, it is really seen as a zero-sum game. That support that's going to Russian civil society is less support that's going to Ukrainian civil society or to Ukraine. And there are, I'm getting almost shivers talking about, because it has just become a very uncomfortable moment, because the overarching question I hear from civil society in Ukraine is, okay, so here you have these Russians, for years you've been trying to bring us together so we can learn from each other. And they were seen as sort of our big brothers almost in activism. And to what end? And look where they ended up, right? That society is now the aggressor society, and they're leading a war. And that civil society that we were supposed to learn from over all these years couldn't stop it. And there is a lot of resentment about any, usage of, for example, the disclaimers that this is done by a foreign agent. Like there's a lot of resentment on behalf of Ukrainian civil society for any kind of obedience of Russian state's laws towards Russian activists. So I think the atmosphere is quite toxic there. And again, this is not to undermine, obviously, Ukrainian suffering, and this is not to take away from all the reasons behind that. But I think in terms of global philanthropy, that's definitely undermining support for Russian civil society. So that's one. I will say also donors are not the most creative bunch. It's very hard right now to get money into Russia. It's very hard to figure out whom to support. And I think it's sort of just easier not to do it, right? If you have a pot of money to give away, why are you going to jump through all the hoops, pay all the fees, go through all the schemes that are currently required, when you don't have to do that and you can just do something else, right? I think there is this perpetual conversation that Alex Cooley and I have been trying to lead on and engage in as to what does it even mean to support people in exile, right? The donor, if I had $1 for every question at every donor roundtable, how long can we support exiles for them to stay relevant? I just can't believe we're still talking about that in this day and age, where actually globally we have activists in exile from not just Russia, but from countless countries around the world, and we just don't seem to learn. We keep on asking the same questions. So I think there are a lot of barriers, Josh, right now to sort of supporting Russian civil society. And I think also we kind of expect there to be this unified Russian civil society, which I don't think is the case. I actually appreciate the pluralism and the diversity. Even within Russian civil society, the attitude to the people who stayed is very, very different. Some people themselves don't want to talk to anyone who stayed behind, right? They see that as an act of treason, as an act of acquiescence to something that's absolutely not acceptable, whereas others are much more understanding and others are into building the kind of bridges. And I would say also Ukrainian civil society is also not homogeneous, right? There are people who are actually very vocally saying we need to support civil society there because that's a neighbor who is, whatever happens there's 140 million people and they're not going anywhere. But I think having more critical conversations that are pushing us to have these difficult conversations, right? Like as I'm answering right now, I'm really like, can anything be taken out of context? Can I be quoted, as saying that Ukraine doesn't deserve support? Like, I think having more of these conversations is really critically important. And also for donors to really not be lazy and really push themselves to think of ways to continue supporting. even though I think in terms of, KPIs and indicators, maybe all your previous support, it's hard to show for right now at this moment, but you just need to keep going because this is not the moment to look away or step aside.
Janet, did you want to jump in?
I was going to take it in a little bit different direction, which is that as I'm a recovering Russianist, in the sense that what I've been focusing on a lot over the last 9 months is what's happening in Ukraine. That I feel like most of us trained within a field that, is Russian East European studies, and that we recentered Russia in our rhetoric and need to think about how we do and study Russia, especially as a comparative politics scholar, right? I sort of have this black box around the country. I mean, not completely, but right, that's our orientation. So, what Tatiana was saying about, it was hard for me to actually pull back and start thinking again about Russian civil society. I think those pressures for funding are the same for our field as a whole. I would also say, I think, Josh, your question about external support had radically changed already. That was a pre-war thing, right? That these organizations, I think mostly for good, were learning how to function in a domestic environment. I mean, it was very repressive and, they definitely could have had more money, but I think the fact that they were forced to do so after living off of some easily accessible grants was mostly a good thing. And I think that laid the groundwork for some of the stuff that, the kind of civil society that it's emerged and the grassroots mobilization that has emerged is amazing. So then the question is, right, how do we support them? Is it monetary? Is it normative? And what are the consequences of supporting civil society when anti-Westernness is as was put forth, is such the problem? And I don't have a solution to that, except, I love that Jeremy's been able to go in and have these conversations, because I think that's the important thing, and my graduate students and then friends and colleagues who are engaging on little conversations in Telegram with our Russian colleagues and friends to try to let them know what's really going on. And, those are the things I think we can also do. At heart, I'm an anti-war activist.
Natalia, did you want to?
Yeah, I think, the obstacles related to just it's physically difficult to get money to Russia. It's just the logistics of it have become so complicated. It's it is a huge obstacle. So I totally see how the discussion between, supporting Ukraine versus supporting Russian civil society. But I think in real terms, I do not believe Russian society is supporting it would cost nearly as much, not even close. It's not a big sum of money that we're talking about. So I can't imagine there are no donors that would be able to give them money. I think it is more about just it's dangerous. It's all these reasons for why Western support is difficult. But I also think, one other kind of support that is very important is just the moral support, because you can find so many fights online. It's incredible how the activists who left are blaming those who didn't leave, who left in different times, blaming each other. But I think one thing we should remember is that if Russia is ever, moved to some more democratic direction, it's going to be people inside Russia. I cannot see how a diaspora without a good connection to people inside Russia can make any difference. So, and just keeping those connections, developing those connections to the people who are on the ground, even if they're not prominent activists, if they're not, marching on the street all the time. I think those things are really important. It is important for them to know that people outside understand their circumstances and are ready to, help them.
Okay, so Grigor, I see your hand. I wanted to throw out one other question for you and Jeremy, but also both of you should feel free to jump in on this one, which is that, it's been fascinating here having these kind of reports from on the ground. And I echo Tim's point, what a great panel to be able to have the two distinct, different approaches to this from Grigor and Jeremy. But I'm wondering how both of you think about essentially the inferences we can make from measuring the opinions, whether it's quantitatively or qualitatively, for people who are willing to talk to researchers in this climate. And Grigo, I know you've thought about list experiments and things like that, whether there's social desirability bias, but like, should we, like, I'm just sort of really curious about how you think about this, about like, are there things systematically different at this point in time, or is it kind of business as usual for dealing with researchers, because part of the milieu of this war has been things are supposed to be business as usual inside of Russia, and as I think it was Tatjana mentioned, right? It's not supposed to be, Soviet dissident world where, you can't talk to people or anything like that. So I wanted to throw that question out too, but you guys should feel free to just answer the other two questions that we put forward as well. We have about 5 minutes left, so just to give a heads up on that. Grigo?
Yeah, thank you. So this question of how we should interpret these answers is a really difficult one, and in a sense, and I've heard from people who are doing surveys in person, and basically there the fear factor is really significant. Apparently, in some cases, when interviewers knock at the door, they think that they're out to get them for the mobilization and so on. So it's a little bit less clear how that works in an online context, and that is one of the things that we're trying to figure out, right? How much of this kind of, we don't know who the people are who do not answer, but we can at least gauge the level of sort of fear and preference falsification on this front. On this, just one quick 2 cents on this whole question about Western support, because I agree that sort of walking away from Russian civil society at this point seems like a shame. At the same time, given Natalia's point earlier about how sort of the West is seen as the source of all evil, and this is one of the things we saw. We actually ran some survey experiments where we tried to expose people to a sort of different interpretation of casualties. It was based on a BBC article and so on, and people basically resisted that, right? They don't buy that frame. Even if they're exposed to that frame, they don't buy that frame. And so in that sense, associating any kind of information or any kind of support with the West in this kind of context ends up being very tricky for those involved. And you don't have to be a Putin supporter for that to be the case. So that is the part that I really worry about in a sense. And sort of one final point, and I don't know, is that we do find that, at least as far as the emotional response to some of these things, the anti-Nazi frame does seem to matter. I don't know that it matters so much in changing attitudes towards the war, but it does matter in terms of in some of the emotional, in an emotional sense. And so people who are exposed to this kind of anti-Nazi frame seem to sort of feel better about the war at some level, because at least, we're fighting the bad guys. And so that again is something that I think it's going to be very difficult to try to sort of puncture that from the outside. I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Grigo. Jeremy?
Yeah, so what others have said, we should be morally supporting civil society opposition, and I guess, yeah, the elephant in the room is we've given Putin so much ammunition to reinforce this narrative that others have spoken about, which is that the West is the source of all evil, that this is a war between Russia and NATO. I'm not saying that's the case, but certainly, perhaps as one of your only European-based people here, right? Mm-hmm. Cancelling all visas, tourist visas, most of which are not actually used for most of which since the war began have not been used for tourism, was really an own goal in terms of countering this extremely effective narrative, as Grigoria said, of the NATO, of presenting this war as a conflict between Russia and NATO. So what Natalia said, moral support, and just showing that that perhaps our response is not this blanket cancellation of all things Russia and Russian. However understandable that response might be because of what the Russian government has done in Ukraine. So yeah, that's something that we should really emphasize, and I'm really glad Natalia and Grigory have kind of ended on that. The Russian state has been extremely effective in selling one message and one message only, which is that however this started, it's turned into a civilizational, confrontation, and that really does cut through, in terms of, well, if the world is against us, then yeah, I will respond to Grigori's survey saying that I support, because if I don't support it, well, what's the alternative? So that's a more depressing response to than the one that I've previously given. If I've got like 10 seconds, center regions, we didn't really talk about center regions very much, which was one of the questions. We shouldn't again lose sight of how Moscow is still relatively protected from the war and also protected from significant risk of mobilization. We home in on people being recruited from the street, but actually, that's really the exception, not the rule, if you live in Moscow. However, it certainly is a real risk in the provinces, in the places that I study, and certainly feeds into this resignation and despair that I observe.
Great. Thank you all very much. This was really, I think, a terrific discussion on an important topic. And I think it's especially important just to keep alternative narratives out there about Russia's future, given the Kremlin's insistence that the current state of Russia is somehow normal or natural, or the teleological next evolution of Russia, rather than the choices of individuals in the Kremlin and on the ground in Russia. So I think a focus on civil society reminds us that Russian society has agency too, and that the future is not written in stone by any stretch, and what ordinary Russians and elite Russians, and perhaps even what Western analysts say and do, might be able to influence that outcome. So I want to thank all the panelists for what I thought was a really great discussion. Thank the organizers of the workshop, which I know it's always a lot of work, so that's much appreciated. Thank the funders at the Carnegie Corporation of New York, and thank the Jordan Center and the Harriman Institute. And we look forward to seeing you again, and keep December 9th on your calendar open around this time, and we'll be back with more details on what you can expect. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.